Fighting inflammation by eating anti-inflammatory foods is like fighting a forest fire with a garden hose. And you could eat all the turmeric in the world, and it's not going to make one bit of difference on the actual cause of inflammation. And we see these markers of inflammation and to measure them. Well, where the heck is it coming from? What is causing the inflammation?
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to another episode of Better with Dr. Stephanie. It's me, your host, Dr. Stephanie Estima. Today, we're talking all about gut health and maybe more than any other episode that I've had, what to actually do about it. So if you are somebody whose gut is just not gutting, it's like you are having distress, whether it is distension, bloating, gas, you are not digesting your foods, or if you're a woman in menopause and you're noticing that your gut is changing. This is very, very common in those perimenopausal and menopausal years. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Gundry, and we were talking all about the gut-brain link and his new book, The Gut-Brain Paradox. So Dr. Stephen Gundry is a renowned cardiac surgeon and multiple New York Times bestselling author. He has had a distinguished career in performing thousands of surgeries, and he made a pretty dramatic shift upon discovering that he could reverse chronic disease using diet alone. He is the author of the groundbreaking book, The Plant Paradox, and he is here today to discuss his new book, The Gut-Brain Paradox, which reveals the stunning connection between our microbiome and our mental health. You are going to learn so much today about the modern insults to our gut, the history of that, and then again, most importantly, what we can do about it. Foods to avoid, foods to be consuming, how we can reduce insults like oxalates and phytates and lectins. You can still consume foods that have those things, but how we might process them a little differently to honor the gut, and what are some of the things that we can do to heal a leaky gut. I think that you're going to find this episode fascinating, as I did. There's a bit of historical context in here to help you understand how we in the West have gotten so far off path. And then, some action items and some strategies for you to begin to heal your digestive system. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Stephen Gundry. All right, Dr. Stephen Gundry, welcome back to the show. I wanted to have you on the show for just talking about your new book, The Gut-Brain Paradox. And I would say just as a general theme, as I've observed your work and the many books that you've written over the years, one of the central tenets that I think you talk about is inflammation. So I wanted to maybe start there in the context of gut health. So how does inflammation drive up some of the diseases that we see in modern day life? And then I would love to sort of start walking into what are some of the things, if we are inflamed and inflamed at the level of the gut, how can we begin to reverse that?
Yeah, that's a good place. I wish I was the person who thought about this, but Hippocrates, the father of medicine 2,500 years ago, said that all disease begins in the gut. And how this guy knew this is, I've been spending 30 years now trying to figure it out, and I get closer every year, but he knew it 2,500 years ago. One of the things I think we make a mistake in talking about inflammation, certainly through the years now, we've been guided that inflammation underlies heart disease. Inflammation underlies brain problems, dementia, Parkinson's. Kind of choose the system inflammation underlies it. Even cancer, there's some really good correlations with inflammation we could get into. So, and everybody says, well, the secret to this is we should be eating anti-inflammatory foods, whatever that means. Now, living in California, I like to use the example that when we have our forest fires, which we do, fighting a forest fire by eating anti-inflammatory foods, or fighting inflammation by eating anti-inflammatory foods, is like fighting a forest fire with a garden hose. And you could eat all the turmeric in the world, And it's not going to make one bit of difference on the actual cause of inflammation. And as I urge my colleagues and my patients that, we see these markers of inflammation and to measure them, well, where the heck is it coming from? What is causing the inflammation? Okay, inflammation is bad for us. We all agree. But what started the fire in the first place? And that's where Hippocrates comes in. And that's where really the research with this cute little worm, C. elegans, that I write about all the time comes in. And the work of Alessio Fasano, the great pediatric gastroenterologist from Italy who's now at Harvard, his work in really defining how the mechanisms of leaky gut can be measured, the underlying ways leaky gut happens. In fact, he, I think, stole a line from me in a Paris conference, but that's okay. He wrote the article that Hippocrates was right. All disease begins in a leaky gut. And that, I think, is really the point that Hippocrates was trying to make, that inflammation begins as the gut wall is breached. And it is our method of dealing with foreign invaders. And those foreign invaders are destroyed, or at least fought, by our immune system, our white blood cells, with inflammation. And so if that's true, and he thinks it's true, I think it's true, many others think it's true now, then where we have to work on taming inflammation or stopping inflammation is repairing the wall of the gut. And I mentioned C. elegans. And in longevity research, one of the models that has really stood the test of time, which was a very useful model, still is this little cute little worm called C. elegans. And it's a little translucent worm, about 3/4 of an inch long. And it only lives for about 3 weeks. So it's a wonderful worm to study if you're interested in lifespan prolongation and health span prolongation. And interestingly enough, this worm has a gut, and it has a microbiome, and its wall of its gut is only one cell thick, just like ours. So we have obviously a much larger surface area of gut wall than C. elegans has. We have 1 or 2 tennis courts of surface area in our gut, but we only have one cell that separates everything we swallow and our microbiome from us. And so is C. elegans. And on the other side of the wall of our gut, and the other side of C. elegans' wall of the gut, most of our immune system, most of our white blood cells live there. What are they doing down there? I was a general surgeon. I had to train as a general surgeon before I became a heart surgeon. And down in the belly, we'd see all these forts of white blood cells, all these lymph nodes, just throughout the belly. And you go, geez, look at all these fortifications down here. What are those guys doing down there? We didn't know much about it then, but look at all those guys. Well, now we know that on the other side of our gut, most of our defense system is located there, because this is the first place that things can penetrate into us. And it would behoove us to have a lot of guys down there to handle trouble that comes through. Now, way back when, we used to have a really good microbiome that was diverse, that was capable of handling most anything we swallowed, including plant compounds that don't like us. We can get into that. And they defend us. And this microbiome would actually educate the immune system. That basically said, hey, you guys, I know you're over there. We've got everything handled. We can handle anything that comes down to the pike. Go have a donut, a cigarette, and relax. We've got your back. Well, now, as your listeners know, we don't have much of a microbiome anymore, and we don't have to go into why that is. Or if you want to, we can. And so they're not only not there anymore to handle what is thrown at them, but they're not there anymore to tell the immune system that, hey, we got your back. And now I can tell you that almost every day the wall of our gut gets penetrated. And that's okay, because now our immune system says, there's a bad actor that we recognize, whether it's a bacteria, whether it's a plant compound, and okay, we'll whack it and we'll kill it, and that'll be the end of it. But now, so this was a maybe once a day thing, but now every second, every hour, 365 days a year, the wall of our gut is being broken down and leaky gut. And our immune system literally gets overwhelmed. And it sends out messages in the form of inflammatory cytokines that not only can they not hold the wall, but the hordes are getting past us. And arm yourselves, defend yourselves, because they're coming your way. And these messages are picked up in our blood vessels. These messages are picked up by the immune system of the brain, the microglial cells, the astrocytes. And now these guys are armed with Kevlar vests and AK-47s, and their fingers on the trigger. And anything that even sniffs of being foreign, they pull the trigger. So getting back to C. elegans. The cool thing about C. elegans is that every anti-aging, whatever that means, trick that's used on C. elegans, whether it's calorie restriction, whether it's a polyphenol like resveratrol, whether it's cold plunges, that works in C. elegans to extend its lifespan, it always works in higher animals, whether it's rats, mice, rhesus monkeys, and probably humans. So it's a really good model. So what happens with C. elegans, and it really drives almost all of my thought process, is C. elegans does fine as long as the wall of the gut is intact, of its little gut. But as that wall begins to break down, as it becomes porous, C. elegans slows down, its movements get more retarded, it gets less interested in food, and then it packs it in. But as long as that cell wall is intact, C. elegans just goes about its business and doesn't die. And so all of these things that we use to extend the lifespan of C. elegans, to me, when it comes down to it, as long as those things keep the gut wall intact in C. elegans, it does fine. And if that's true, and if Hippocrates was right that all disease begins in the gut, then to me, keeping that wall intact should be our primary objective.
So you said that the microbiome used to be diverse, used to be capable, used to educate the immune system. And so it would be, if those things are no longer true today, then what are some of the action items that we can think about? You mentioned that, having turmeric or curcumin, as an anti-inflammatory to try to bring down systemic inflammation is akin to trying to put out, the LA fires with a garden hose. What would be some of the actionable strategies that we can talk about that can help with promoting, patching up some of the leakiness, the leaky holes in that system?
So it's multifactorial, and I've now written 10 books on how to do it. And I just signed a contract for another 2. I'm glutton for punishment. But anyhow, because this we learn really more and more on how what it takes to do this. And I guess the more we learn, the more challenging it gets. When I started treating leaky gut 25 years ago, I thought, this is a piece of cake. I can fix leaky gut in a couple of weeks. And, boy, was I naive.
Books later.
10 books later.
Yeah.
Most people, it legitimately takes 9 months to a year to repair leaky gut. It's the longest it's ever taken one of my patients, believe it or not, 4 years. Mm-hmm. And that's an exception, but I certainly seen it definitely take more than a year in many cases. And again, that's, wow, why the heck does it take so long? And I think it comes down to one of the things that was a great blessing of the Human Microbiome Project, which was actually completed in 2017, the year the Plant Paradox was published. And I did not have a lot of the knowledge that we now have from the Human Microbiome Project. But people like Usham, who was battling with Pasteur, who I talk about in this current book, for supremacy of the germ theory of disease causation. Anyhow, leaky gut can occur when we swallow plant compounds like lectins or like oxalates. And we used to have an incredibly useful defense system against these plant compounds. It's a balance of powers between plants that don't want to eat them and animals that do want to eat them. And plants have their mechanisms of defense, which, among other things, are lectins and oxalates and phytates. And animals have their own mechanisms of counteracting these, and that was primarily our microbiome. There is a microbiome that can eat gluten. Love it. We know there's a microbiome that can eat oxalates. And people who have oxalate stones are sensitive to oxalates. When we look at their microbiome, they don't have any oxalate-eating bacteria. So no wonder they're sensitive to oxalates. So that balance of power was pretty doggone good. And then really the middle 1970s was really the turning point in almost everything bad that happened to us. And I was actually in medical school in the mid-1970s. And looking back, I got to witness all of this happening in real time. So what happened? Number one, broad-spectrum antibiotics were introduced. And I can remember that they were miraculous because before the use of broad-spectrum antibiotics, if we were treating an infection, number one, we had to culture the bacteria. And a great number of these bacteria we couldn't grow. We didn't know that then, but let's suppose we did grow them. And then we would have to test these bacteria against various antibiotics and figure out which antibiotic would work and which wouldn't. And this would take days. And these were really sick people. And a great number of them died. So when broad-spectrum antibiotics were created in the middle 70s, all of a sudden now we had an AK-47, with a 200-gun magazine load, bullet load, set on automatic. And we
to squash an ant, to squash the equivalent of an ant.
We could just mow these guys down. And they were miraculous. It was just like, oh my gosh. We have Pasteur was right. We are the kingdom. We have conquered the germ kingdom, and they are ours, and we are the victors. Little did we know that our microbiome, which we didn't even really know existed, was being killed, particularly by oral broad-spectrum antibiotics. We had no idea that this would have happened. So that's kind of number one. Number two, what order should we take? Let's take NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents. Now, back in the good old days, aspirin was really one of our mainstays against a lot of autoimmune diseases, like rheumatoid arthritis, for instance. Mm-hmm. And one of the downsides of aspirin, as many people my age know, is that it really was pretty good at causing gastric ulcers, ulcers in the stomach. And so pharmaceutical companies learned that you could develop non-steroidal anti-inflammatories that did their damage not in the stomach, but they did their damage down in the small intestine. And the damage wasn't as extensive as aspirin would cause, but these drugs were considered so dangerous that in the mid-1970s, when they were introduced, you could only write a prescription for Advil or Aleve or Naproxen for 2 weeks. And it had to be a prescription only. And you could only fill it for 2 weeks because they were too dangerous. And I remember those days. Why? Because the pharmaceutical companies knew, and there's wonderful documents that show this, that a gastroscope, we could see ulcers in the stomach. And we could see ulcers in the first part of the duodenum, but we couldn't get below that. And the damage that these agents did was down in the small bowel, where we couldn't see. And so they said, hey, this is a great pain reliever, and it doesn't cause holes in the stomach, and here you go. And of course, now we now know that it's like swallowing a hand grenade. You can produce holes in the small intestines extremely easily with NSAIDs. And I got interested in them because early in my treating of autoimmune diseases, I used to see a number of athletes who would just out of the blue develop Crohn's or rheumatoid arthritis or lupus following an injury. And they were treated with high-dose anti-inflammatory drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And I've written about this in some of my previous books, but these things, this was known about to the drug companies. And now these things are, the number one selling pharmaceutical product in the world. And we swallow them like candy. And what's fascinating is drug companies know the more you swallow, the more leaky gut you cause. The leaky gut causes more activation of the immune system, which causes more inflammation. And the more inflammation you get, the more of these you will take. And then, of course, you'll get upgraded to opioids because those things will finally stop working. And they knew about this. So that's number 2. Number 3 is glyphosate, Roundup. So glyphosate was patented by Monsanto in the 1970s as an antibiotic. It was not patented as a weed killer. And it was just almost through serendipity that they learned that glyphosate in the water of a pond, and I think it was in Missouri, all the plants, all the algae in the pond died from glyphosate being thrown out in the wastewater. And they go, wow, look at that, nothing's living in there. And isn't that cool? And the rest is history. They realized that they could genetically engineer soybeans and then corn to resist the action of glyphosate and killing them. And again, the rest is history. But so originally it was used as a treatment of GMO crops. So you could spray the soybeans and they wouldn't die, but all the other weeds would die. You could spray the corn and it wouldn't die, and all the other weeds would die, et cetera, et cetera. And GMO got an ugly name, and people go, oh, I don't buy GMO food, ooh, evil. Big agriculture, and I grew up in Nebraska, big agriculture knows that it is much more efficient to harvest a plant when it is dead. It is much more efficient to harvest corn when the corn stalk is dead. It is much more efficient to harvest wheat when the wheat stalk is dead. Oats, dead. Because water is a pain in the neck to deal with in hauling. It costs you money to haul wet things, but it's much cheaper to haul dry things. So fast forward about 15 years ago, smart people said, gee, we've got all these expensive harvesting equipment, and it would be really nice to know that on September 1st, in this patch in Iowa, the corn will be dead, and we can have our machines there. And it would be great to know that on September 7th, in this patch in Nebraska, that corn will be dead or the wheat will be dead, and we can have our machine there. So how are we going to accomplish that? Well, we've got this great plant killer called Roundup, and what we'll do is we'll just spray these conventional crops with Roundup as a desiccant, and then we can harvest these crops. And they won't be GMO crops. They'll be conventional crops. And we don't have to tell anybody that they're being sprayed with Roundup because the FDA, in its wisdom, says that Roundup is harmless to humans. Shall I continue with how that was determined?
Yeah, why don't we just to round out the story, tell us why that was determined to
The
be
only
safe
reason I can
for
tell
humans.
this story
Yeah.
is I love.
Yeah.
So plants live, and their cell function uses what's called the shikimate pathway. And it's such a fun word, shikimate.
It sounds like you're swearing, but
it
you're
does,
not.
doesn't it? Yeah, I don't swear, but shikimate is pretty good. So they determined, which is true, that animals don't have the shikimate pathway. They don't use the shikimate pathway. Mm-hmm. So that it would be perfectly fine to spray plants with Roundup and feed them to animals because it's totally harmless to animals, which quote unquote is true. And the FDA says, yep, we get it. Now, they didn't bother to mention that they already knew that bacteria use the shikimate pathway. That's how they patented it as an antibiotic. And those of us who are, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but mitochondria are bacteria. They have bacterial DNA, and they use the shikimate pathway. So lo and behold, unknowingly, glyphosate was introduced to our food supply to make most conventional grains easy to harvest. And nobody said, well, you better wash this stuff off because it's dangerous, because it's not dangerous to humans. The FDA says it's perfectly safe. So what happens? So these conventional food products are fed to our animals, and that gets incorporated in their flesh, but probably more importantly, they get incorporated into our conventional products, our grain products, our bread products, our soybean products, a great number of our oil products, because it's much easier to harvest these things. And so, as unfortunately most people know, glyphosate is everywhere in us. It's in most California wines, for goodness sakes. And we can measure glyphosate levels in humans, and most of the time it's pretty scary. The Environmental Working Group, Consumer Reports have tested numbers of American products, grain products. Most organic oats are contaminated with glyphosate. So what we've done is we've inadvertently used antibiotics in our food in the form of glyphosate to, again, decimate this population of our microbiome. And as I write about in gut-brain paradox, it even gets worse. The ones that are most effective to glyphosate are the tryptophan pathway producing bacteria, the serotonin producing guys. And so isn't it odd that since the 1970s, the incidence of anxiety and depression has gone through the roof. Now, let's not discount social media, let's not discount COVID, but there's a pretty good graph that just follows anxiety and depression beginning in the mid-70s. And okay, so that's the glyphosate story. So you've got really kind of a triple punch, and there's more that we can go into. Let's go into microplastics, but that's another story.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that we have these modern insults. So in 1970s, we have this introduction of broad-spectrum antibiotics. Then we have the NSAIDs, the aspirin, that are affecting the small bowel and gastric ulcers. And then we have this antibiotic, the glyphosate, which, as we've said before, affects the mitochondria. And you mentioned just before that healing the microbiome takes somewhere between 9 to 12 months typically on average. And you've seen certainly outliers to that, up to 4 years in one case.
Yep.
I think about the audience who's listening. So this is primarily a perimenopausal and menopausal audience. These are females. And this is the time when we start seeing diagnoses of autoimmunity. So the lupus, the multiple sclerosis, the rheumatoid arthritis, the Hashimoto's thyroiditis, all of these different autoimmune conditions. And you mentioned earlier in our conversation that if the immune system has this onslaught of several times a day, all the time, there's these food particles or these things that are slipping through that one cell lining of the gut, then it would make sense that over time, and then as you know, for women, we have this perfect storm where we see these decline in our reproductive hormones, some of these protective hormones for us, where our capacity for stress now is much lower. And now we see these physiological changes, and compounding that with these insults and the leaky gut that most of us probably have. I'm sure that this is your clinical observation as well. But my question here with this big preamble is, do we think that there's a different susceptibility in terms of the gut lining between males and females?
Well, one of the things that I've written about and other people have written about is we now know that particularly estrogen has a tremendous effect on the microbiome population, right, and the diversity of the microbiome. And we think that that's one of your huge benefits that you have over men. And that as estrogen finally disappears and you guys sadly start acting like men in terms of all those stupid things that happen to you. You were much stronger when you had estrogen, and then you caught up with us. And as I like to remind my male patients, most of them have far more estrogen than their wives in their later years. And it's like, hey guys, you think your wife is the weaker sex? Guess what? You've got more estrogen than your wife. What do you think about that? So anyway, so one of the things that's sad about women, you guys have to handle and basically ignore the largest parasite in the world, your baby, your fetus, for 9 months. And you have to literally switch off your immune system to just ignore this parasite. And one of the things...
That's how we refer to our children, by the way, still. We still refer to them as parasites.
Particularly when they move back home.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But we could do a whole podcast on that. Anyhow,
yes, yeah.
No, my 2 daughters are listening. Love you guys.
Yes, love you guys so much. Yeah, and you still are parasites. Yeah.
Anyhow, so one of the cool things about autoimmune diseases in women that I treat, and 80% of my practice is autoimmune disease that are troublemakers. You guys, most women go into remission of their autoimmune disease during pregnancy. And it's just this marvelous period of time. And what interested me early on is that so many women, their first real storm of autoimmune disease happened postpartum, when all of a sudden it's like a switch was turned on. And we can argue why that is. During delivery, did a lot of foreign toxins breach the gut wall? Did the gut wall become ischemic during delivery? And there's lots of good research about this. Did baby compounds get through the placenta into the bloodstream during this time period? Whatever reason, the immune system really seems to get hyperactive postpartum. And again, I can't tell you the number of patients who their Hashimoto's, their rheumatoid arthritis, their lupus, their Crohn's, their ulcerative colitis first appeared after their first or sometimes second child. And and emotional stress will also do it. A ton of my female patients can point literally to the day or week that their autoimmune condition started, and it was usually a horrible thing. And one of my patients was 12 years old when her mother suddenly died, and she developed Crohn's literally a couple of months later, and so on and so forth. And they can point to this trauma, a divorce, a job change. And why? Well, one of the things I think does happen is your microbiome definitely changes, but your gut wall becomes very ischemic. We have so many marathon runners that I treat that don't realize that a marathon run will literally put your immune system on dead for about 6 weeks after the marathon. I mean, it becomes...
There's going to be so many comments. I don't know why all the runners find my account and they're like, how dare you? I have been running and I am fine. It's like, okay, you might be the outlier, but the vast majority of people can't run properly just from a mechanical perspective, always injured. And after a marathon, you are almost dead. You are almost dead at that point.
Yeah,
So,
my
yes.
wife was a great marathoner. She qualified for the 100th running of the Boston Marathon and finished. And
Yeah.
When I showed her the data after that race of what you do to your heart, what you do to your immune system, she hung it up. She really did. She said, holy cow. And one of my good friends is Mark Sisson, who Primal Kitchen. Mm-hmm. And, he was one of the great marathoners, one of the great triathletes. And he thinks in his latest book is really kind of fun, Born to Walk, and he's learned this is one of the worst things you can do. You were not designed for this. Sorry. And all these super wonderful cushioned shoes just make things worse, as he brilliantly describes in his book. But that's another story. So anyhow.
Shout out to Paluva. We love the Paluvas. We love his shoes as well.
There you go.
Yep.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So...
No, but to your point, when I was going through my divorce, it was a horrible time. I have never had eczema at any other point in my life, but I can tell you my entire face, around my eyes, around my mouth, covered in like scales. And it was because of the stress. I had young children at the time. It was very, very, very difficult. And it was crazy. And I'm sure if I had the mind to look at some of my gut markers, that we would see, first of all, rampant systemic inflammation, but changes in the diversity and the composition of my gut microbiome. Like I've never seen changes in my skin that pronounced ever again. Yeah.
Right. And we should realize that really the lining of our gut is just our skin turned inside out.
Right.
And that everything that we swallow is actually outside of us in a tunnel. And people go, what do you mean? I swallowed it. It's inside me. No, it's not. If you look at a car going through the Holland Tunnel, you would swear that you saw that car go into the river and it came out the other side of the river and it's not sopping wet. And you said, well, I watched it go into the river. Well, no, you didn't. You watched it go through a tunnel. And this is our skin turned inside out. So is it any wonder that so many of these things that are happening in the wall of our gut are reflected on the same surface? And Yeah, you're right. It's like, holy cow, that's on the inside of my gut right now. It's like,
Yeah.
geez, that doesn't sound like a good idea.
Talk a little bit more about estrogen. I know that in the gut, I've taught this to clinicians around the estrobolome and the importance of having just a certain amount of gut bacteria that are dedicated to conjugating and eliminating, or just basically setting the estrogen to be eliminated. Like estrogen's golden rule is use it and then lose it. If it hangs around too long, maybe you want, I don't know if we want to get into beta glucuronidase or any of that nerdy stuff, but talk to us a little bit about the estrobolome and where that is in the gut and why that's important in terms of metabolism of our sex hormones as well.
Yeah, and again, I think with almost every week, we're beginning to realize what all these guys are doing down there. And luckily, we now can count them. But just as an example, we've known about this keystone species called Akkermansia muciniphila for a number of years now. Mm-hmm. But it turns out there's a huge number of different species of Akkermansia. And one of them in particular that I've gotten interested in is really good at making you skinny. And I won't go into the mechanism. But the other ones aren't. So we're getting so subspecies specific about what each of these guys is doing that you watch soon. I don't know how to define soon, but we will have personalized medicine that really is personalizing the microbiome, and it hopefully will come to a point that someone who doesn't have a great estrobolome that is conjugating these estrogens the way it should, maybe we can introduce that set of bacteria, give them what they want to eat, which is the holy grail of all this, and it keeps me up at night, that we can build a better body, build a better microbiome. So the microbiome is really sensitive, let's just say, to estrogen, and for obviously a very good reason. But that's been one of the missing pieces of why menopause is so entertaining for American women. But when I travel the world looking at these super old people, you mention menopause to them, and they go, "What are you talking about?" And you go, what was it like? And what do you mean, what was it like? One day I stopped having periods, and that was a wonderful thing. What do you mean? And you'll go, what are hot flashes, mood swings? No, what are you talking about? And my wife's actually a wonderful example of that. She, you remember extremely well. We were in Paris in February, and it was really cold. And we had friends who were right next door to us in an adjoining room, and my wife had her first and only hot flash, and she flung open the windows, which was bad enough, and she took all the covers off our bed and opened the door to our friends and threw them in there and say, "Lock the door, don't let them in." And I got to experience her menopause that night, and believe it or not, that was it for her. That was it. And so as we study, these people, these long-lived people in France and Italy, specifically in Greece, they just don't report this stuff. And I think that one of the reasons is that they've got this really great, diverse microbiome that has been handling this from the word go, that kind of takes over where things are needed. And it's not even part of their language. And that's going to make all of the American women get mad at me. But it's not our culture. It's actually our food. It's our food.
I don't think that there's anything inherently different from an American woman versus an Italian woman or a Greek woman. What I do think, though, is I think there's different food laws. One of the things we know, at least I know about, at least Italian, the Italian food and agriculture, they are incredible. Like, they have heritage laws that you can't call, Parmigiano Reggiano has to be grown in a certain part, and it has to be, anointed by a certain, like someone has to go and check to make sure. Like they are very, very strict with their food laws. And I don't think that we have that in the West. I do think that there is a lot of the laws that we have governing food safety are very much run by lobby groups. And, again, conspiracy theorist or not, like call me whatever you want. But I just think that there's a lot of profit in keeping people sick. And when the food industry is being run not by someone who is concerned about getting you off medication, but concerned about getting how many medications can you tolerate without killing you instantly, I think that we have different laws. And not to say that Europe is without it, doesn't have its problems. Yeah, it has. They have their own, social. They have their own stuff. But I would say the food. Whenever I go to Italy, I freely enjoy pasta and bread and gelato, which I don't really consume. I mean, I make my own sourdough bread at home. I have my own starter that's been alive for several years, but I don't really buy that food from the grocery store because I don't feel good when I consume that. But I'm fine when I consume it over there, and I know it has to do with the cows that are there and the wheat varieties. But yeah, all of that. But I also think that their wheat crops they're not, marinating in the glyphosate as we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's one thing that's been very interesting to me through the years. My autoimmune patients will resolve their autoimmune disease. They become negative for all their markers, and their leaky gut's gone. And they'll go over to France or Italy, and they can't help themselves. They'll have the croissant and the baguette and the gelato or the pizza, and they do not react. And they go, wow, Dr. Gundry's cured me. I can have all this stuff again. And they come back here and they start eating our stuff. And within 2 or 3 weeks, they're on the phone, psoriasis flared or joint flared or
the joints.
Their ulcerative colitis flared. And they go, what the heck? I thought you cured me. I said, no.
Yeah.
You started eating glyphosate-laden food over there, and you non-glyphosate food, and it didn't affect you. You came back here, ate our stuff, and there you go.
So if we could give our Betties some action items. So what are some, I know you're a big fan of olive oil, again, very much in line with the like the Italians and the Greeks are going to be thrilled to hear that, and anyone that's descendant of them. But what are some 3 foods that we should always be incorporating into our, maybe, or consistently incorporating into our food regimens? And then are there foods that we should be avoiding? I know you mentioned lectins and oxalates and phytates earlier. I don't know if that comes into the foods to avoid, if you feel like there's genetic predisposition, like some people are more, like I'll say, for example, on my mother's side, we're Lebanese. And so we have a lot of lentils and chickpeas, but I remember my grandmother soaking them. So she would just soak them before she would make salads or whatever she'd do with them. So
why do you do that?
Well, I don't know. I just copied what she did. Like I copied what my Sitto did, and I do the same thing now. So if I ever have chickpeas, I buy them dried. I don't buy them in the can, and then I'll rehydrate them and let them soak for a little bit. But 3, so foods to avoid, foods that we should be incorporating, and then maybe we can touch on my Lebanese grandmother or the practices that maybe she, soaking and pressure cooking, things like that.
Yeah. So like I tell my patients, look, I can seal your leaky gut. It's going to take a while, but if you swallow razor blades, you will slice it right back open. And I'll give you a personal example that I've written about and published about. Years ago, when we really changed our practice to autoimmune diseases, we did all the autoimmune panels on all of us in the office. And my office manager comes running in and says, Doc, you've got lupus. And I go, I don't have lupus. Come on. She says, yeah, you're positive for anti-nuclear antibody. And I'm going, well, that's interesting because my father's side of the family has horrible psoriasis. My dad was on methotrexate, a powerful immunosuppressant, for 51 years. He was one of the first to actually be given it. And my aunt the same way. So there is a family history component to autoimmune disease. It's not as powerful as most people think, but there is a component. So I said, okay, that's interesting. And I'm always experimenting with food. That's my job. So I said, I'm going to follow my yes and no list. I'm not going to eat any no food, and I'm going to recheck it in 3 weeks. Okay? 3 weeks later, I recheck my anti-nuclear antibodies. Negative. Okay. That kind of helps me prove my point. So fast forward a number of years, and I was in New York City on Friday editing the Longevity Paradox book, and we didn't finish. And I said, well, what the heck? I'll stay the weekend. We'll start Monday morning, and I'll fly home Monday afternoon. And so I had a weekend to kill without my wife. And I said, I wonder if I can reactivate my anti-nuclear antibody. And so I cheated.
That is a normal thought that anyone would have for a weekend in New York.
And of one. So, I had bread, I had pasta, I had tomatoes that were peeled and de-seeded. I had beans, what else? Pizza and American ice cream. And so we come back and I draw my blood. And sure enough, my anti-nuclear antibody is positive and was actually a lot higher than when I had first checked it. I said, wow, that's cool. I said, I wonder how fast I can make it go negative. So we scheduled me to be drawn once a week because I figured, well, okay, let's see. 1 week later, I'm negative. And I go, So what does that teach me? Number one is that hopefully by now, I've got a pretty doggone good microbiome. And I've got a pretty intact wall of the gut. And I've got an immune system that might listen to me. But even with all that, swallowing razor blades for a weekend can cause leaky gut, activate my immune system. But finally, I can repair it pretty doggone quickly. So I can undo that damage, and it won't take me 9 months. But so, and I see this in so many of my patients, even tiny cheats, that for certain people just start the whole process, and we almost have to start all over again. So my first principle is it's not what I tell you to eat that's important. It's what I tell you not to eat. And when you are defenseless, and most of us are defenseless against these plant compounds, then it's just easy to get rid of grains and pseudo grains, with the exception of sorghum and millet, which don't have a hull. If you're of Hispanic heritage, hopefully you know that the Indian cultures who developed corn always treated their corn with boiling it in lime juice or treating it with lye, a process called nixtamalization to remove the hull from corn and to stabilize so that it couldn't bind niacin. And that makes hominy, and that's ground into masa flour, and all tortillas traditionally are made from masa harina flour. And we found that most people can tolerate that, but they can't tolerate regular corn. And one of my assistants was just over in Greece, and she says, you're not going to believe this. Everywhere I went, all the salads, the tomatoes were peeled and de-seeded, and all the peppers were peeled and de-seeded, and all the cucumbers were peeled and de-seeded. What do you think about that? And I said, yeah, same thing happens in Istanbul, Turkey. When I go to meet with Italian chefs, the first thing they tell me is you cannot make pasta sauce without peeling and de-seeding the tomatoes. You cannot do that. It's lethal if you throw the peels and seeds in. And I said, how do you know this? Who taught you that? What do you mean who taught me that? My mother. Who taught her? My grandmother. The Italians refused to eat tomatoes for 200 years after their native son Columbus brought them back because they were so dangerous. And why did your mother soak chickpeas? It turns out, and I wrote about this in the book, beans and plant leaves and anything have their own microbiome. And the reason you soak, and anyone who's soaked a pot of beans knows that this scum comes to the top, and it's kind of bubbly and scummy, and you scrape it off and you change the water, and then the next soapy scummy. Guess what's happening? That's called fermentation. And the bacteria are eating the lectins. And in Tuscany, where beans are really part and parcel of the culture, they always soak their beans for 48 hours before they cook them.
Yeah.
So it's these wives' tales that really educate us. I mean, 4 billion people use rice as their staple. Why do 4 billion people take the hull off of brown rice and eat it white? They must know how bad white rice is for them and how good brown rice is for them. No. Why did Europeans and Middle Easterners always work on getting the hull off of wheat and, making it white? And why was there competition that Egyptian wheat was much safer for you? Because it was whiter and it didn't have as thick a hull. And you look at these cultures, which is kind of what I do, and you go, son of a gun, these guys have figured this out years and years and years ago. And we've lost, a lot of it is we've lost this oral tradition because families no longer live together. Parents and grandparents and kids either live together or live next door or within walking distance, and those traditions are lost.
What about pressure cooking? What do you think about
Pressure
that?
cooking really helps. Pressure cooking will destroy lectins. It unfortunately will not destroy gluten. Gluten cannot be broken by a pressure cooker. We've tried, and we've had a lot of patients experiment. I have a number of patients that are from South America, and particularly Brazil, where beans and rice are the staple. And to a person, they always say that their mothers taught them, you'll always pressure cook. And several of my patients, true story, my mother blew up a pressure cooker when I was young. It was exciting. It was really exciting. But so they had one of my patients who had horrible lupus since a teenager. He dates it to when his mother's pressure cooker exploded and they stopped pressure cooking their beans and rice. And
Oh my gosh.
yeah. And when he told me the story, I said, yeah, of course, your mom knew better. And no wonder you got lupus. Now he doesn't have it anymore, but interesting, huh?
That is interesting. Yeah. And it is interesting, this idea that maybe civilizations that have predated ours knew something, without having papers to read through and
They just
Dr.
knew.
Gundry to sort through the science and write books for us. Like they sort of, there was some knowledge that has been lost, that has been, not passed on orally, as you mentioned. I think that there's something to that. And yeah, I find that very interesting personally, just coming from mixed backgrounds as well. Like I'm Portuguese, Lebanese, so would see some of these different, not understanding why, but just like, okay, this is how my grandma did it, so I'm just going to do it, just continue to do it. But I think that there's some of that that's lost in Western culture as well. And I think what you're doing is just trying to restore some of that, what has, what we once knew, but no longer maybe is common in the ether of sort of common knowledge, let's say.
Yeah, and you mentioned something I think is very important, and it needs a shout out. There's a professor at Colorado State University who I've talked to a number of times, and I have a lot of respect for, Lauren Cordain, and he's the father of the paleo diet. And he proposed many years ago that the autoimmune theory of molecular mimicry. And the longer all of us do this, the more I'm convinced that he was right. And that is, and I'll use it from a plant standpoint, our immune system literally is a barcode reader, a scanner. And it reads the molecular barcode on any protein that it encounters to decide whether it recognizes that protein or knows that protein, and that protein isn't something to be really worried about, but keep an eye on, or it's a protein that is foreign and should be destroyed. And so it literally scans. They're called toll-like receptors. And so we think, the theory is that plants in their wisdom, lectins are proteins, and plants in their wisdom don't want to be eaten. So they make the barcodes on these proteins very similar to the barcodes in us, in And if this theory is true, so when leaky gut occurs and the immune system is activated, the immune system, among other things, we go to threat level 5. Everybody's carrying around their AK-47s with the finger on the trigger. And I tell them, we scrambled the fighter jets, and the fighter jets are going around our body with a picture of what they're looking for, of the barcode. Because maybe these guys have gotten loose, and we don't want to miss them. So let's use Hashimoto's. So these fighter jets head into your thyroid, and they see some proteins in your thyroid that look remarkably similar to what they're looking for. It's not the same, but it's close enough, and you're at war. Shoot now, and maybe you'll get a medal when you return to base. And so the molecular theory, molecular mimicry theory, is we're not making a mistake. We're actually after a barcode that we think is bad, but it's very close. And why would plants do this? Because if an animal isn't thriving, if an animal isn't feeling well, a smart animal will stop eating that plant. Plant wins, the animal wins. I learned this growing up in Nebraska. Omaha had the world's largest stockyards when I was growing up, a claim to fame. And at that time, we were just starting to bring cattle in from the ranges and fattening them up for slaughter. And we would feed them corn and soybeans because they're really good at fattening cattle and humans.
And humans, yep.
Mm-hmm. Corn and soybeans. You want to fatten something, that's how to do it. And the problem was that the cows wouldn't eat the corn and soybeans. They got severe heartburn, and they wouldn't eat it. So some smart guy said, hey, Tums relieves heartburns, calcium carbonate. Why don't we mix calcium carbonate in with the corn and soybean? And so most people don't know it, but about a third of all the calcium carbonate produced in the United States is mixed into cattle food.
Wow.
So they won't get heartburn. And it's like those cows knew, they had pain when they ate this stuff, and they're rather smart animals. Now, what we do is we take a Prilosec or a Nexium and we eat our corn dog. And isn't that wonderful?
Doc, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I think that you provide a really great platform for understanding the gut-brain axis. And I think the gut has been something I have traditionally, it has just seemed so vast and so diverse that it's been so difficult to treat clinically. If you have someone coming in with, I can run gut pat and I can say, oh, there's more zonulin in the stool. It's like, okay, and what do I do with that information? I think that you've provided a very clear roadmap and landscape for understanding the gut, and then for clinicians, as there are many that are listening, how we might think about counseling our patients and helping them reconstitute the gut so that the gut can come back to this, diverse, capable, and this function of educating the immune system that we've been talking about. So wanted to thank you for your time. As always, it's just a delight to talk to you, and thank you so much for your work.
Great to see you. Thank you for having me. The good news is it is fixable. Bad news is it takes some time. And I guess one of the depressing things that with these new stool tests, just swallowing probiotics, even important probiotics, sadly isn't doing it. It just isn't doing it. And I use the example in one of my offices, of course, is in Palm Springs. And I use the example as I sell them grass seed. And they come back a couple months later and they said, you sold me bad grass seed. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, it didn't grow. And I said, well, what did you do with it? They said, what do you mean? I took it out to the desert, I spread it around on the sand, and it didn't grow. You sold me a bad grass seed. And I went, well, did you water it? No, you didn't tell me to. Well, did you fertilize it? No, you didn't tell me to. I said, well, what did you expect? So the care and feeding of this microbiome is far more complex than we could have ever imagined. I have people who are swallowing Akkermansia, living Akkermansia, and it will not grow in their gut.
Yeah.
And most of my patients do not make butyrate and do not make short chain fatty acids. And to me, it's really scary, particularly since we know that there's this incredible uptick in colon cancer in 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds.
Yeah.
We know that the colon cells, 80% of their nourishment is derived from butyrate, not from blood flow, it's not from protein, it's butyrate. And when we see these people that literally have no butyrate in their guts, you go, well, no wonder these colon cells are hangry, and they become dysmorphic and dysplastic. So
That's one of the things I've always sort of had a problem with probiotics. You see these probiotics that are refrigerated in whatever store, and it's like, what makes you think if they need to be refrigerated in the store that they're going to survive the acid in your gut and your human body temperature? If you need to cool them down, what is the odds that they're going to make it past the stomach? So I'm really glad that you brought that up in terms of really the terrain. Like, you can put grass seed in a desert, it's not going to grow. You can have a 3 billion CFU lactobacillus, whatever, and it's just not going to take. Yeah. So maybe my last question to you is, if those are some of the things that you don't recommend, do you like things like fermented foods and natto? And like, what are some of the ways that we can get probiotic, or the healthy types of the healthy types of bacteria that are going to thrive in that environment?
Well, the more fermented foods and or the products of fermentation that you get in your diet, the better. One of the easiest ways is vinegar. Vinegar is acetic acid, and acetic acid is critical in the chain of making butyrate, which is also a short chain fatty acid.
Yeah.
And so vinegar is easy. And fermented foods like goat and sheep yogurt, so many of these super old people are literally goat and sheep farmers. And they're eating goat and sheep yogurt, they're eating goat and sheep cheeses, they're eating fermented sausages, folks. I read the last 2 books. If you ferment sausages, actually, which is how all traditional sausages were preserved, you not only eat a very nasty sugar compound called Nu-5GC, but you actually produce huge amounts of spermidine and polyamines, which are really great actually to help the gut wall repair. So don't be afraid of actually having some fermented sausages. Most of these super old people do. It was one of the things that surprised me. And prosciutto, true prosciutto, prosciutto di Parma, is a fermented food. Fun fact.
Huh. And what about olive oil? You sent me a bottle of
I'm
your
glad you
your
asked.
oil. Yes.
Two very interesting things. So our olive oil has 30 times more polyphenol than any olive oil that's been tested. It's really interesting stuff.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Number 2, it turns out that olive oil has its own microbiome. And olives have their own microbiome. And the microbiome in olives is really good at promoting gut diversity. So who would have imagined, for instance, you mentioned the Greeks and their olive oil. The average Greek per person in Greece consumes 26 liters of olive oil per year. That's a half a liter per person per week. And guess what? The little babies aren't eating a half a liter. So most
Yeah.
Greeks are having a liter of olive oil per week. And some of my haters say, oh, that's fake. Nobody does that. Well, really? Those are the statistics. And the famous Predimed study, people were supposed to consume a liter of olive oil per week. And that was the instructions. I know the researchers.
And it's great moisturizer.
It is.
I'll say, I use it for moisturizer.
Sophia Loren, one of the great beauties of all time, credits olive oil with her skin. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right.
Awesome. All right. This has been so wonderful. Dr. Gundry, we'll make sure that we have all the links for you in the show notes. And thank you again for your time. This has been great.
Pleasure. Great to see you again, Stephanie.
Thanks. Welcome to the after party where I tell you my real thoughts on the conversation that you just listened to. I really like Steve. So I will say that I have been vocal online and on this podcast about my disdain for, we'll call them influencers in the space on social media and otherwise, that talk about plants as bad and dangerous, and they have oxalates and they have lectins and phytates and they're stealing from you and all these different things. And it's like, well, all you got to do with oxalates is steam. You know, if you are scared of spinach and the high oxalate, because spinach has a very high oxalate content, all you have to do is really steam it and it gets rid of 90% of your oxalates. And so I love the way that Dr. Gundry talks about, hey, you should be aware that some of these things have high oxalate content, high phytate, high all of this. And there are civilizations that came before us that would soak, let's say, beans in water, would pressure cook things, that Hispanics would make masa instead of, traditional flour tortillas, let's say, that we should be avoiding grains, except with the exception of millet. So I love his, yes, these are potentially dangerous for some. And here are some of the ways that humans have done it in the past. So I'll start off saying that I find his breadth of knowledge, he can really go down any rabbit hole you throw at him, which is really lovely. And this is one of the reasons why I think I like and admire him so much. I loved the conversation and the part about estrogen, the estrobolome in the gut microbiome, and how we as women, estrogen is sort of like our metabolic superpower, and how as we lose estrogen, this can sort of make some of the things that we were talking about with leaky gut worse. I personally really like the reference to children as parasites. Of course, love my kids. They're the best. Wouldn't trade them for the world. And technically a parasite in utero. And maybe you can make the argument that for the amount that I pay in fees for soccer and all the other extracurricular things, still, parasite's going to be parasiting. So enjoyed that conversation, and really just I think the way that he laid out the sort of modern onslaughts to the microbiome. So with in the mid 1970s, the broad spectrum antibiotics, the NSAIDs, and glyphosate as an antibiotic, I think that lays a really smart groundwork or framework for us to understand why our gut microbiome is so under attack, even if you think that you're buying healthy foods, how it's so under attack in modern day, Western society, and then some of the things that we can do about it. And I loved that he referenced Sophia Loren. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see that she's right behind me. Oh, she's right there at all times. Linda Carter and Sophia Loren always consulting me from my back bookshelf. So I enjoyed that as well. And my other sort of favorite part, and I even mentioned it when he was saying it, he's like, I was in New York. It was a Friday night. Wife was back home. And I was like, what can a guy do? Let me just see if I can increase my anti-nuclear antibodies. It makes me laugh when I'm like, what? That's something I totally would do. I'd be like, N of one experience. Let's have fun on a Friday night. So really enjoyed that story as a way to sort of demonstrate how quickly our bodies also can adapt to. So love this conversation. I hope that you took a lot out of it. So you're going to find some vinegar. You're going to find fermented foods. You're going to stop taking probiotics. Maybe you're going to avoid grains, or if you do consume things like chickpeas and or lentils and or spinach, you're going to soak them in water. Maybe you'll pressure cook things. Maybe you'll, do some of the techniques that we talked about on the show. I certainly am I have apple cider vinegar on the door of my fridge, and I do remember to take it sometimes, but just a conversation like this is going to really kick me back into, I got to take a shot of this all the time. Like I got to take a shot of this before I eat. I got to take a shot of this, in the morning or, whenever it is. I usually take it in the morning. So thank you very much, Dr. Gundry, for this conversation. And I hope you found this useful as well. If you did and you're finding value from the podcast, please feel free to leave us a comment, a review, a heart, a star, a unicorn, a smile, anything in any of the ways on any of the platforms. We do read all we at least read the comments and the stars on Spotify and YouTube. If you would like to send us virtual kisses and rainbows, of course, we will receive those as well. So with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much.